On a freezing April morning in 1917, tens of thousands of Canadian troops raced from their trenches and secretly dug tunnels under the no-man's land that separated them from the enemy. It was a perilous mission, but one which was vital if they were to have any hope of capturing the Western Front as most infamous and deadly obstacle, the formidable Vimy Ridge. Over the next 3 days, in a remarkable display of courage under fire, they would advance through the German lines and capture the ridge, a feat which had eluded the Allies for over 2 years and at a cost of some 11,000 dead or wounded. And it happened to be caught on film. Join us today as we revisit this forgotten footage and discover the epic story of Canada's greatest victory. The year before, the British and French had repeatedly tried and failed to capture the high ground overlooking the surrounding area, leading it to become known as No Man's Land. And in the spring of 1917, it was the main obstacle preventing the Allies from breaking through the enemy lines. At its base, the ridge rose 180 meters or 600 feet up from the surrounding terrain, giving whoever controlled it an overwhelming advantage over the battlefield below. What made Vimy particularly deadly was its location. The ridge dominated the landscape immediately south of the city of Arras, which was one of the main objectives of the upcoming British offensive known as Operation Alberic. Once the Germans were driven out of Arras, the plan was to exploit their breakthrough by racing forward across no man's land and capturing the high ground. But as had been proven time and time again, assaulting across no man's land was a near-suicide mission. Troops were exposed to withering machine gun fire from the enemy trenches, not to mention the snipers, artillery, and barbed wire. For over 2 years, the British and French had attempted such frontal assaults, suffering staggering casualties in the process, but failing to make any lasting gains. Then came the Canadians. In early 1917, the Imperial German Army had dug so deep into the surrounding landscape that capturing the city of Arras looked set to be a near impossible task, even with the British and French forces combining their efforts. This is why Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Currie, commander of the Canadian Corps, was given a bold new mission: take the ridge by any means necessary. While technically part of the British Expeditionary Force, the Canadian Corps was a largely independent command with its own infantry, artillery, tanks, and reinforcements. It was also blessed with arguably the best leadership of any unit on the Western Front. Under the British commander Field Marshal Douglas Haig, who had a reputation for being tactically inflexible and overly concerned with his own prestige, hundreds of thousands of men had been lost needlessly. By contrast, the Canadians had suffered heavy losses too. But by 1917, their corps had become renowned for its aggressive tactics and daring assaults, all thanks to the inspiring leadership of generals like Currie. Rather than being bogged down by doctrine and red tape, Currie and his commanders took full advantage of the talents of their men, often tailoring their tactics to suit the strengths of the Canadian soldiers, something which became known as Canadian style. As military historian Tim Cook explains, Canadian style was characterized by a decentralized system of command, one which placed greater initiative and autonomy into the hands of junior leaders and individual soldiers. This proved particularly effective in situations where troops had to contend with dense wire entanglements and enemy machine guns, as well as when launching surprise attacks. It was this combination of bold thinking and daring action which led Currie to conclude that there was only one way to break the stalemate around Vimy Ridge: dig a vast network of tunnels beneath no man's land and then storm the position in a surprise assault. The problem was pulling off such a risky plan would require secrecy, lots of it. As historian Jack Granatstein puts it, secrecy was absolutely essential to the success of the operation. If the Germans had discovered the plan, the attackers would have walked into a deadly trap. Currie therefore tasked Major General Jules Lecaine with coming up with a plan to divert the Germans away from the tunnel entrance. Meanwhile, Major General David Watson was tasked with planning the assault itself. However, the biggest challenge facing the Canadians was not the enemy, but rather their own supply lines. To pull off such a risky mission, the Canadian troops needed supplies, equipment, and ammunition, all of which had to be brought within close proximity of the enemy. Fortunately, Watson had a secret weapon at his disposal, the 2nd Canadian Tunneling Company, a specialist underground engineering unit which had spent the last year building a series of vast networks of tunnels beneath the front lines. Using the latest mining and tunneling technology, including self-loading hoists, steam shovels, and electrically powered cutting bits, these tunnels were dug mostly out of sight and hearing of the enemy, and once completed, they would stretch almost entirely beneath no man's land, allowing the Canadian troops to pop up almost directly behind enemy lines. In total, 34 separate mines were dug, each capable of holding around 300 men and their equipment. Although nowhere near long enough to reach the other side of no man's land, they did come close enough that, combined with the diversions staged by Lacane, it seemed likely that the Germans would never know what hit them. So on the night of April 9th, 1917, the Canadian troops filed into the mines. All around them were piled sacks of explosives, as well as thousands of rifles, pistols, bombs, and grenades. There were also piles of shovel and pickaxe blades for once the soldiers reached the enemy trenches. They were ordered to leave their rifles and heavy equipment behind and charge the enemy with nothing but a knife and possibly a revolver. Before entering the tunnels, each soldier was issued with a small piece of chalk. They were instructed to rub it on the inside of the nearest trench they came across once inside. Then, and only then, were they to stand up and yell "Canada" as loud as they could. If they encountered resistance, they were told to hurl a grenade and fight with their knives. If they didn't use the chalk, then they weren't Canadian, according to legend. With their orders complete, the soldiers waited for the signal to charge. And when it came, they wasted no time in filing out of the mines and racing across the open ground towards the stunned and confused Germans. As planned, the attack was completely unexpected. The Germans had no idea that just underneath their feet, thousands of Canadian troops were making their way towards the trenches. And so it came as a complete shock when suddenly, right in the middle of the night, they heard yelling in English and French and saw white chalk markings all over the inside of their trenches. To add to their confusion, the Germans couldn't see any sign of the attackers, nor could they hear any gunfire or the telltale rattle of machine guns. It was as though ghosts had somehow penetrated their lines. All around them, the Germans were dropping like flies, victims of grenades and knives wielded by charging Canadians. Within minutes, the entire German line had been overwhelmed. The Canadians pressed their attack, hunting the enemy down in their dugouts and gun emplacements. They fought with a combination of desperation and ferocity, determined to capture the high ground at all costs. By the end of the first day, the Germans had suffered over 6,000 casualties, while the Canadians had suffered just 1,500. It was at that point that the Germans realized what had happened. An entire army had materialized out of thin air and was now tearing through their positions. Unfortunately for the Germans, there was nothing they could do to stop it. Not only had the Canadian tunnels penetrated deep enough beneath their trenches to avoid detection, but their positions had been carefully selected to ensure the Germans couldn't simply shift across and out of the way. Of the 34 mines used, only one failed to emerge directly behind enemy lines. And that was because the Germans had built a particularly strong defensive line across the far side of the ridge. Quickly realizing that they were trapped, the Germans retreated into the hills behind the ridge, hoping to regroup and launch a counterattack. But the Canadians were relentless. Pressing their attack, they quickly advanced another 5 kilometers or 3 miles, capturing more trenches, artillery pieces, and prisoners along the way. On April, they had taken more than 2,000 prisoners and advanced another 3 miles, taking the village of Vimy and reaching the edge of the ridge. But despite having captured the ridge's eastern face, the fighting was far from over. On April, the Canadians continued their advance, battling house to house and clearing out every vestige of the enemy. But by that point, the hard fighting was done. Having achieved total surprise and employing their innovative techniques, the Canadian troops had managed to capture one of the most heavily defended positions in the West without suffering catastrophic losses. Even the Germans were forced to admit that the Canadians had fought with a tenacity and determination unlike anything they'd ever seen before. It had been a decisive victory, and one which would never have been possible had the Canadians not had the benefit of modern technology to help them execute their daring plan. Of the 100,000 or so men involved, some 3,500 were killed and 7,400 wounded. But as a result, the Western Front had been irreparably broken. Despite the heavy casualties, the remaining German defenses were crumbling, and it wasn't long before the British and French were able to advance alongside their Canadian comrades, racing towards victory. In all, 4.5 million men would fight in the battles of Vimy Ridge, with the Germans suffering 215,